While I was fighting for my life, recovering from open-heart surgery, my own brother was methodically stealing the company I had spent my life building. He used forged medical reports to declare me mentally incompetent to our clients and our lawyer, and then had the audacity to throw a lavish successes party in my honor. He invited me, expecting a grateful, broken old man to stand up and give a toast. He didn't know I had discovered everything. He thought he was getting a round of applause. Instead, he was about to get a lesson in consequences, and his smile was about to disappear forever. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit subscribe so you never miss an ending, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Now, let's get back to the story. The chest pain hit me during the quarterly review meeting on a Thursday afternoon in October, sharp, radiating down my left arm, making my vision blur at the edges while Gary was presenting the sales numbers to our biggest clients. I managed to finish the meeting, shake hands with Mr. Thompson and the other partners, and maintain the professional composure I'd cultivated over 23 years of building Mitchell Electronics from a garage startup into a $12 million specialized components company. But Sarah knew something was wrong the moment I walked through our front door. "Alan, you look gray," my wife said, dropping the kitchen towel she'd been holding and moving toward me with the concerned efficiency of someone who'd been married to a workaholic for 28 years. "Just tired," I told Sarah, but even as I said it, I felt the crushing weight in my chest return, stronger this time. Sarah didn't argue. She called 911 while I sat in my favorite chair, trying to breathe around the pressure that felt like someone was standing on my sternum. The paramedics confirmed what I already knew but didn't want to acknowledge. Heart attack, probably massive, requiring immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Rodriguez at St. Mary's explained the situation with the calm precision of someone who'd delivered similar news hundreds of times. "Mr. Mitchell, you have severe blockages in 3 major arteries. We need to perform triple bypass surgery as soon as possible," Dr. Rodriguez said. "How long will I be out of commission?" I asked, already thinking about the contracts we had pending, the product launch scheduled for January, the employees who depended on steady leadership. 6 weeks minimum for initial recovery. 3 months before you should consider returning to full-time work. 6 months before you're completely back to normal," Dr. Rodriguez said. 6 months. In the electronics components business, 6 months was enough time for competitors to steal clients, suppliers to find new partnerships, and employees to start looking elsewhere for job security. "Sarah, you need to call Gary," I told my wife as the nurses prepared me for surgery. "He'll have to run things while I'm recovering." Gary was my younger brother by 4 years, my sales director for the past 8 years, and the only family member who understood the technical aspects of our business well enough to keep operations running smoothly. Sarah squeezed my hand with the fierce grip of someone trying to transfer strength through touch. "Don't worry about the company right now. Focus on getting better. Gary will take care of everything," she said. As they wheeled me into the operating room, I remember thinking that I'd built Mitchell Electronics to be resilient enough to survive temporary leadership transitions. I'd trained Gary well, established clear protocols, and created systems that could function without my daily oversight. What I hadn't anticipated was that my brother had been planning for exactly this kind of opportunity for years. The surgery took 7 hours. Dr. Rodriguez later told Sarah that they'd found more damage than the initial tests had revealed, requiring additional grafts and more extensive repair work than originally planned. I woke up 3 days later with tubes in my chest, wires monitoring every heartbeat, and the kind of drug disorientation that makes simple thoughts feel like complex mathematical problems. Gary was sitting beside my hospital bed when I finally opened my eyes and stayed conscious long enough to recognize him. My younger brother looked tired but relieved, wearing the navy suit I'd bought him for client presentations and holding a folder of what appeared to be business documents. "How are you feeling?" Gary asked, leaning forward with the concerned expression of someone who'd been genuinely worried about losing a family member. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I managed to say through the oxygen mask. "How's the company?" Gary's expression shifted slightly from personal concern to professional confidence. "Everything's running smoothly. Maria's handling the day-to-day operations, I'm managing client relations, and the team knows this is temporary until you're back on your feet," Gary said. "Any problems I should know about?" I asked. "Nothing we can't handle." A few clients asked about your condition, but I assured them that Mitchell Electronics has the depth of leadership to maintain service quality regardless of temporary health issues, Gary replied. The answer was professionally appropriate but somehow felt rehearsed, as if Gary had practiced delivering updates that would reassure me without providing specific details. Gary, I need you to bring me the Thompson contract revisions tomorrow. And the quarterly financials. I can review them here, I said. Gary's hesitation was so brief I might have imagined it. Alan, the doctor said you need to focus on recovery, not business stress. Let me handle everything until you're stronger, he said. Reviewing contracts isn't stress, it's what I do, I replied. The doctors were very specific about avoiding work-related activities during the first few weeks. Sarah agrees that your only job right now is getting healthy, Gary said. Sarah nodded from her chair by the window, her face carrying the exhaustion of 3 days spent in hospital waiting rooms. The business will survive a few weeks without you micromanaging every decision, she said to me. I wanted to argue, but the medication made sustained conversation difficult, and both Gary and Sarah seemed determined to protect me from work-related stress, whether I wanted protection or not. Over the next 2 weeks, Gary visited regularly with updates that were both reassuring and frustratingly vague. Business was steady, clients were satisfied, employees were handling their responsibilities professionally. But something felt off about his reports. Too smooth, too confident, lacking the specific details and minor problems that normally peppered daily business operations. Gary, what happened with the Henderson order? They usually have delivery requirements that create scheduling challenges, I asked during one of his visits. Handled it. No problems, Gary said without elaborating. And the Peterson component specifications? They were requesting modifications that required engineering review, I pressed. All resolved. The client's satisfied with our proposed solutions, Gary replied. The answers were correct but empty, like summaries written by someone who'd been briefed on outcomes but hadn't been involved in the actual problem-solving process. When I mentioned my concerns to Sarah, she dismissed them as the natural anxiety of a control-oriented business owner forced into temporary passivity. Alan, you've trained Gary for 8 years. You've always said he has good instincts for client relations and problem-solving, Sarah said. Trust him to do the job you prepared him for. Sarah was right. I had trained Gary extensively, included him in strategic planning sessions, and gradually increased his decision-making authority over the years. But I'd also noticed that Gary sometimes struggled with the technical aspects of our products, relied heavily on Maria for financial analysis, and had a tendency to oversell capabilities when trying to close difficult deals. 3 weeks after the surgery, Dr. Rodriguez cleared me for short visits home, provided I continued to rest and avoid stressful activities. The first time Sarah drove me back to our house, I felt like a tourist visiting a place that used to be familiar. The house looked the same, but I felt disconnected from the routines and responsibilities that had defined my daily life for decades. It's going to take time to feel normal again, Sarah said as she helped me settle into my recliner with a stack of books and the television remote. Your body needs to heal, and your mind needs to adjust to moving at a different pace. That evening, Maria called to check on my recovery. Maria Gonzalez had been Mitchell Electronics' office manager and bookkeeper for 15 years, someone I trusted completely with both financial details and employee relations. Mr. Mitchell, how are you feeling? Maria asked, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine concern mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. Getting stronger every day. How are things at the office? I asked Maria. Busy. Gary's been working very long hours, meeting with clients, handling the contracts you usually manage, Maria said. There was something careful about her tone, as if she were choosing her words deliberately. Any problems I should know about? I asked. Maria hesitated before answering. Nothing urgent, a few questions about procedures, some client requests that required clarification. Gary's been managing everything, she said. Maria, is there something specific you want to discuss? I pressed. Another pause. Mr. Mitchell, maybe we should wait until you're feeling completely better before discussing business details. Gary said you needed to focus on recovery without workplace distractions, Maria said. The conversation left me with the uncomfortable feeling that important information was being filtered through Gary's judgment about what I should or shouldn't know about my own company. But I was still weak, still dependent on others for transportation and daily assistance, still taking medications that made concentration difficult. I told myself that my discomfort was probably just the natural anxiety of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of his business being forced to delegate authority to others. What I didn't realize was that Gary had been planning for exactly this kind of opportunity since the day I'd made him sales director, and that my heart attack had given him the perfect excuse to implement plans he'd been developing for years. 6 weeks after the surgery, I was strong enough to drive myself to the physical therapy appointments that Dr. Rodriguez insisted were essential for complete recovery. The routine gave me a sense of independence I'd been missing, even if I still tired easily and couldn't lift anything heavier than a coffee mug. During one of these drives, I decided to take a detour past the Mitchell Electronics office building, not to stop or interfere with Gary's management, just to see the familiar site of the place I'd built from nothing over 2 decades. What I saw in the parking lot made my reconstructed heart skip several beats. A black Mercedes S-Class with temporary dealer plates sat in my reserved parking space, the one marked President, that I'd used every workday for 15 years. Gary drove a 10-year-old Honda Accord. He'd always been careful with money, claiming he preferred to invest in experiences rather than expensive cars. The Mercedes represented more money than Gary had ever spent on anything in his adult life. I sat in my car across the street, studying the building I'd designed and paid for, trying to process what the luxury vehicle might mean. Maybe Gary was meeting with a wealthy client. Maybe the car belonged to a vendor or consultant. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that didn't involve my brother spending company money on personal transportation. But the car was parked in my space, not in a visitor slot, and something about seeing it there felt like a violation of territory that went beyond practical parking arrangements. That evening, I mentioned the Mercedes to Sarah while we were eating the low-sodium dinner she'd prepared according to my post-surgery dietary restrictions. "I drove past the office today and saw an expensive car in my parking space," I told Sarah. "Maybe Gary was meeting with an important client," Sarah suggested, echoing my own hope for an innocent explanation. "Maybe, but it had temporary plates like someone had just bought it," I said. Sarah set down her fork and looked at me with the expression she used when she thought I was overthinking minor details. "Alan, you're looking for problems because you feel disconnected from the business. Gary's been running things successfully for 6 weeks. Trust that he's making appropriate decisions," she said. Sarah was probably right. I was accustomed to knowing every detail of Mitchell Electronics' daily operations, and the forced distance was making me suspicious of normal business activities. But the next morning, I called Maria at her direct extension, the line that bypassed the main receptionist and connected directly to her office. "Mr. Mitchell, how are you feeling?" Maria asked when she recognized my voice. "Much better, thanks. Maria, I have a question about company expenses. Has Gary made any unusual purchases recently? Equipment, vehicles, anything outside normal operations?" I asked. The silence on Maria's end lasted long enough to confirm my suspicions. "Mr. Mitchell, I think you should discuss expense matters directly with Gary," she said finally. "Maria, I'm asking as the company president. What unusual expenses has Gary authorized?" I pressed. Another pause. "There have been some changes to purchasing procedures. Gary said they were temporary measures to streamline decision-making while you were recovering," Maria said carefully. "What kind of changes?" I asked. "New signature authorities, different approval processes." "Gary said he needed more flexibility to handle client emergencies without delaying decisions," Maria explained. My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't my heart. It was the realization that Gary had been making fundamental changes to company operations without consulting me or getting my approval. "Maria, I need you to email me copies of any financial documents Gary has signed in the past 6 weeks. Purchase orders, contracts, bank authorizations, everything," I said. "Mr. Mitchell, Gary specifically instructed me not to involve you in business matters until Dr. Rodriguez cleared you for full-time work," Maria said. "Maria, I'm the owner of this company. Gary works for me, not the other way around. Send me those documents today," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed over decades of managing employees and handling difficult clients. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell, I'll send everything within the hour," Maria replied. The documents that arrived in my email that afternoon painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation that took my breath away. Gary hadn't just been running the company during my recovery, he'd been restructuring it according to his own vision of how Mitchell Electronics should operate. He'd opened new credit lines using my medical condition as justification for expanded borrowing authority. He'd changed vendor payment terms, restructuring relationships I'd spent years developing. He'd authorized salary increases for himself and his closest allies while freezing wages for employees who'd been loyal to me for decades. Most disturbing was a consulting agreement Gary had signed with Pinnacle Business Solutions, a firm that specialized in corporate restructuring and acquisition preparation. The contract authorized Pinnacle to evaluate Mitchell Electronics for potential ownership transition and management optimization. My brother had hired consultants to help him steal my company while I was recovering from surgery that had nearly killed me. The Mercedes suddenly made perfect sense. Gary had been positioning himself as the permanent successor to Mitchell Electronics' leadership, spending company money to project the image of success he thought would legitimize his takeover. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing every document Maria had sent, cross-referencing them with the financial records I kept at home, trying to understand the full scope of Gary's scheme. By evening, I had a clear picture of what my brother had been planning. Using the medical power of attorney I'd signed before surgery as legal cover, Gary had been systematically transferring control of Mitchell Electronics from me to himself. The power of attorney had been intended to handle emergency medical decisions if I'd been incapacitated during recovery. Gary had expanded its interpretation to include business decisions, claiming that my heart condition made me temporarily incompetent to manage company affairs. When I called James Harrison, the attorney who'd handled Mitchell Electronics' legal matters for 12 years, he confirmed my worst fears. "Alan, Gary contacted me 3 weeks ago with documents claiming you'd authorized him to act as interim president with full decision-making authority," James said. "I questioned the scope of the authorization, but he showed me medical reports suggesting you might be incapacitated for an extended period." "What medical reports?" I asked. "Psychological evaluations suggesting that heart attack trauma had affected your cognitive abilities and judgment." "Gary said Dr. Rodriguez had recommended against involving you in stressful business decisions until you'd completed cardiac rehabilitation," James explained. I felt cold anger building in my chest, the kind of fury that comes from discovering that someone you trusted has been systematically lying about you to mutual friends and associates. "James, Dr. Rodriguez never ordered psychological evaluations. He never suggested I was cognitively impaired. Gary fabricated those reports," I said. "Alan, if that's true, then Gary has committed fraud on a scale that could destroy both him and the company," James said. "I want you to review every document Gary signed in my name or claimed authority to sign. I want a complete audit of his actions since my surgery," I told James. "I'll start immediately. But Alan, if we're going to challenge Gary's actions legally, we need to move quickly before he can complete whatever transition he's planning," James warned. That night, I sat in my home office surrounded by the financial documents that revealed the scope of Gary's betrayal. My younger brother, whom I'd mentored and trusted with the sales operation of my company, had used my medical crisis as an opportunity to steal everything I'd built. But Gary had made one crucial mistake in his planning. He'd assumed I would remain passive and grateful during my recovery, accepting his management decisions without question or investigation. What he hadn't anticipated was that 23 years of building a business from nothing had taught me to recognize threats to my company's survival, and to respond to those threats with the methodical precision that had made Mitchell Electronics successful. Gary was about to learn that stealing a company requires more than forged documents and fabricated medical reports. It requires the victim to stay ignorant of the theft long enough for the transfer to become permanent. The next morning, I called Maria and asked her to schedule a meeting with Mr. Thompson, our biggest client and longest-standing business partner. "Tell him I'm ready to discuss the contract modifications he requested before my surgery," I said. "Mr. Mitchell, Gary told me that all client communications should go through him until you're completely recovered," Maria said. "Maria, I'm giving you a direct instruction as the owner of this company. Schedule the meeting with Mr. Thompson for tomorrow afternoon," I replied. There was a brief pause before Maria responded. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell, I'll call him right away," she said. If Gary wanted to play games with forged documents and fabricated medical reports, I would remind him that owning a company means more than controlling its paperwork. It means maintaining the relationships and trust that make the business valuable in the first place. And Mr. Thompson had been doing business with Mitchell Electronics since our second year of operation. He'd known me long before Gary joined the company, and he understood the difference between temporary health challenges and permanent incompetence. The meeting would give me a chance to assess how much damage Gary's management had done to our most important client relationships, and to begin the process of reclaiming control of the company he'd been trying to steal while I was fighting for my life. The meeting with Mr. Thompson took place in his office downtown, away from Mitchell Electronics where Gary might overhear or interfere. Harold Thompson was 72 years old, a man who'd built his own manufacturing empire through careful relationships and meticulous attention to detail. "Alan, you look better than I expected," Mr. Thompson said as his secretary served coffee in china cups that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Gary's been giving us updates about your condition, but seeing you in person is reassuring." "What kind of updates has Gary been providing?" I asked Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson's expression grew thoughtful. "He's been very concerned about your recovery timeline, suggested that stress-related decision-making might not be advisable for several more months," he said. "Harold, what's your honest assessment of how Gary's been handling our business relationship?" I asked directly. Mr. Thompson set down his coffee cup with the deliberate precision of someone choosing his words carefully. "Gary's enthusiastic and personable. He's clearly knowledgeable about your products and committed to maintaining service quality," he said. "But," I prompted, recognizing the diplomatic tone Mr. Thompson used when delivering criticism wrapped in compliments. "But he's been pushing for contract modifications that seem designed more to benefit Mitchell Electronics than to address our actual needs," Mr. Thompson said. "Price increases, payment term changes, exclusivity clauses that weren't in our original agreements." The picture was becoming clearer. Gary hadn't been maintaining our client relationships. He'd been exploiting them, using my medical crisis as leverage to renegotiate terms that favored his version of company management. "Harold, Gary doesn't have authority to modify our contracts without my approval. What exactly has he been proposing?" I asked. Mr. Thompson pulled out a folder containing correspondence I'd never seen before. Letters on Mitchell Electronics letterhead, signed with Gary's name but claiming to represent decisions made by senior management during my recovery period. The most concerning proposal was Gary's suggestion that Thompson Manufacturing switch to exclusive supplier arrangements with Mitchell Electronics, with a significant price premium for guaranteed priority service, Mr. Thompson explained. I reviewed the documents with growing anger and embarrassment. Gary had been using my reputation and our long-standing relationship to pressure Mr. Thompson into agreements that would have been financially devastating for his company. "Harold, I need you to know that I never authorized these proposals." "Gary exceeded his authority completely," I said to Mr. Thompson. "I suspected as much." "The proposals didn't sound like your usual approach to business relationships," Mr. Thompson replied. "You've always focused on mutual benefit rather than one-sided advantage." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his leather chair, studying my face with the sharp intelligence that had made him successful in manufacturing for 40 years. "Alan, what's really happening at Mitchell Electronics? Because from my perspective, it looks like your brother has been using your medical situation to make changes you wouldn't normally approve," he said. I explained what I'd discovered about Gary's activities, the forged medical reports, the unauthorized financial decisions, and the consultants he'd hired to evaluate the company for ownership transition. Mr. Thompson listened with growing concern. "Alan, Gary approached me 2 weeks ago about purchasing Mitchell Electronics outright. He said you were considering retirement due to health concerns and wanted to ensure the company went to someone who understood your client relationships," Mr. Thompson said. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Gary hadn't been content with temporary management authority. He'd been actively marketing my company for sale while telling clients I was too sick to be involved in the decision. "What did you tell him?" I asked Mr. Thompson. "I told him I'd need to speak with you directly before considering any acquisition discussions. Gary said that might not be possible due to your medical restrictions, but he'd relay any questions I had," Mr. Thompson said. "Harold, I'm not retiring, I'm not selling Mitchell Electronics, and Gary has no authority to make decisions about either possibility," I said. Mr. Thompson nodded with satisfaction. "I'm glad to hear that, because frankly, Alan, your company's value lies in your personal relationships and technical expertise. Without you, Mitchell Electronics would be worth significantly less to any potential buyer," he said. That afternoon, I met with James Harrison to plan my legal response to Gary's scheme. "Alan, your brother has committed multiple felonies," James said after reviewing the evidence. "Fraud, forgery, theft by conversion, potentially embezzlement, depending on how he's been handling company funds." "What's my best course of action?" I asked James. "Immediate legal action to freeze all company accounts and revoke Gary's signatory authority. Criminal charges for the forged documents. Civil litigation to recover any money he's stolen or misappropriated," James said. "James, Gary is my brother. If I pursue criminal charges, I'll destroy him completely," I said. James studied me with the expression of someone who'd seen family loyalty complicate legal decisions hundreds of times. Alan, Gary chose to destroy your company while you were fighting for your life. The question isn't whether pursuing justice will hurt him. The question is whether failing to pursue justice will encourage him to try this again with someone else, James said. I thought about Gary as a child, following me around the garage where I'd first started tinkering with electronic components. The little brother who'd believed I could fix anything, build anything, solve any problem through patience and methodical work. But that little brother had become a man who saw my near-death experience as an opportunity to steal 23 years of my labor and planning. James, I want to handle this in a way that gives Gary one chance to make things right voluntarily before we destroy him legally, I said. What do you have in mind? James asked. I explained my plan. Gary was organizing a celebration party for the following Friday, ostensibly to mark my recovery and return to work, but actually to announce his permanent assumption of company leadership to clients and employees. I want to attend that party. I want to give a speech that exposes exactly what Gary has been doing and offers him one opportunity to resign with dignity before we pursue criminal charges, I said to James. James considered the plan with professional appreciation and personal concern. It's risky, Alan. If Gary realizes you're aware of his scheme, he might accelerate his timeline or destroy evidence, he said. Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't realize what I know until it's too late for him to cover his tracks, I replied. The next day, I called Gary for the first time since discovering his theft. Gary, I heard about the party you're planning for Friday. I'd like to attend if my health permits, I said, keeping my voice weak and grateful. Gary's relief was audible through the phone. Alan, that's wonderful news. The whole team has been asking about you, and having you there would mean everything to everyone, Gary said. I might not stay long, but I'd love the chance to thank everyone for keeping the company running while I've been recovering, I said. Actually, I was hoping you might say a few words. Maybe make a toast to acknowledge the team's hard work, Gary suggested. Nothing stressful, just a brief appreciation for everyone's dedication during a difficult time. Gary was inviting me to deliver my own eulogy for Mitchell Electronics, expecting me to publicly thank him for stealing my life's work while I'd been unconscious in a hospital bed. I'd be honored to make a toast, I told Gary. It will give me a chance to recognize everyone's contributions and discuss the future direction of the company. After hanging up, I realized that Gary's arrogance had given me the perfect opportunity to expose his scheme in front of the employees, clients, and business partners whose respect he was trying to steal, along with my company. Friday's party would determine whether Gary learned voluntary lessons about family loyalty and business ethics, or whether he'd face the complete legal and professional destruction his actions had earned. Either way, Mitchell Electronics would return to the leadership of someone who'd built it through honest work rather than fraudulent manipulation of medical crises. The Mitchell Electronics conference room had been transformed for Gary's celebration. White tablecloths, catered food from downtown's most expensive restaurant, and enough champagne to float a small boat. My brother had spared no expense for the party that was supposed to mark his transition from temporary manager to permanent president. I arrived fashionably late, letting Gary play host to the employees, clients, and business partners he was hoping to impress with his new leadership style. Sarah accompanied me, still worried about my stamina, but understanding that this appearance was important for reasons I hadn't fully explained. Alan, Gary called out when he spotted me near the entrance. Everyone, look who made it! He crossed the room with the confident stride of someone who believed he was about to receive public validation for his successful management of my company. The applause was genuine. Maria beamed from her corner table, clearly relieved to see me looking healthier than the last time I'd visited the office. Several long-term employees approached with warm greetings and updates about their families, their projects, and their appreciation for the stability Gary had provided during uncertain times. Mr. Thompson was there with his business partner, both men wearing the expensive suits and satisfied expressions of clients who'd been well served during a potentially disruptive transition. Harold, thank you for coming, I said to Mr. Thompson, shaking his hand with genuine warmth. Wouldn't miss it. Gary's done an impressive job keeping everything running smoothly, Mr. Thompson replied. Though I'm glad to see you back on your feet. Gary moved through the crowd with the easy charisma that had made him effective in sales, accepting congratulations and deflecting credit with practiced humility. The team did all the real work, Gary told a group of suppliers. I just tried to maintain the standards Alan established. Watching my brother perform for an audience that had no idea he'd been systematically stealing my company was surreal and infuriating in equal measure. but I maintained the role of grateful invalid, accepting sympathy for my health challenges while observing the political dynamics Gary had established during my absence. At 7:30, Gary called for attention and began his prepared remarks. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This celebration represents more than Alan's recovery from a serious health scare," Gary said to the assembled crowd. "It represents Mitchell Electronics' resilience as an organization. Our ability to maintain excellence and growth even during leadership transitions," Gary continued. "Alan built this company through vision and determination. But as he's learned to delegate more responsibility, we've discovered that Mitchell Electronics has the depth of talent to succeed regardless of any individual's involvement." The speech was masterfully crafted, positioning my medical crisis as a planned succession test rather than an emergency that Gary had exploited for personal gain. "Alan has asked me to continue in an expanded leadership role going forward, allowing him to focus on strategic planning while I handle day-to-day operations," Gary said. He was announcing his permanent takeover of my company while making it sound like my decision, delivered with enough medical concern to make opposition seem selfish and unreasonable. "Which brings us to the real reason we're here tonight," Gary continued, raising his champagne glass, "to celebrate not just Alan's recovery, but Mitchell Electronics' evolution into the next phase of our growth." Gary looked directly at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Alan, would you like to say a few words to thank everyone for their support during your recovery?" he asked. The invitation was perfectly calculated. Gary expected me to deliver grateful remarks that would validate his narrative about voluntary leadership transition, cementing his authority in front of witnesses who would spread the story throughout our business community. I stood slowly, accepting the champagne flute Sarah handed me, and walked to the front of the room with the careful movements of someone still recovering from major surgery. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice carrying just enough weakness to maintain the illusion that I was still the grateful patient Gary expected me to be. "When I was lying in that hospital bed 6 weeks ago, not sure whether I'd survived the surgery, I spent a lot of time thinking about Mitchell Electronics and what would happen to the company I'd built. From nothing," I continued. The room was completely silent, everyone hanging on words they expected to be touching and appreciative. "I thought about the employees who trusted me with their careers, the clients who trusted me with their business, and the family members I'd trusted with my life's work," I said, looking directly at Gary. Gary's confident smile was still in place, but I could see uncertainty beginning to flicker in his eyes. "What I discovered during my recovery was truly educational," I continued. "I learned that some people rise to challenges and maintain the values that built an organization. And I learned that other people see crisis as an opportunity to steal what they couldn't earn through honest effort." Gary's face went pale, but he couldn't interrupt without making a scene in front of clients and employees. "I learned that my brother Gary has been using forged medical documents to claim legal authority over Mitchell Electronics that I never granted him," I said, pulling out the folder James Harrison had prepared. The room erupted in murmurs of shock and confusion. Gary stepped forward with his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Alan, I think your medication might be affecting your judgment. Maybe we should discuss this privately," Gary said, trying to maintain control of the narrative. "Gary, I'm not on medication that affects my judgment, but you've been telling people I am to justify decisions you had no right to make," I replied. I opened the folder and began reading from the documents Gary had forged. "According to this psychological evaluation you submitted to our attorney, I'm suffering from cardiac dementia that makes me incompetent to manage business affairs," I said. "The problem is, Gary, this evaluation is dated during a week when I was home recovering, not in any medical facility. The doctor who allegedly conducted this evaluation doesn't exist," I continued. Gary's face was now completely white. Several employees were pulling out their phones, probably to record what was becoming a public exposure of criminal fraud. "But the forged medical reports were just the beginning," I said, turning to address Mr. Thompson directly. "Harold, did Gary tell you I was planning to retire and sell the company?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression grim with understanding. "He proposed that I purchase Mitchell Electronics because you were no longer capable of running it effectively," he confirmed. "Gary has been marketing my company for sale while telling clients I'm too sick to be consulted about the decision," I announced to the room. I pulled out bank statements showing Gary's unauthorized expenses, including the Mercedes lease and consulting fees paid to Pinnacle Business Solutions. "He's been spending company money to project success while negotiating the sale of assets that don't belong to him," I said. Gary finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. Alan, everything I did was to protect the company during your recovery. I never tried to steal anything, Gary said. Gary, you hired consultants to evaluate Mitchell Electronics for ownership transition while I was unconscious in a cardiac ICU. You told our biggest client I was mentally incompetent and offered to sell him the company I built before you were old enough to drive, I replied. The confrontation was devastating to watch, but necessary to complete. Gary had spent weeks building his reputation on lies about my condition and his authority. The truth needed to be spoken in front of the same audience he'd deceived. Most importantly, I continued, Gary has been using a medical power of attorney intended for emergency health decisions to make business decisions he was never authorized to make. I handed Maria a legal document that made her gasp with relief. Effective immediately, all of Gary's signatory authority is revoked. All contracts he signed without my approval are void. All financial decisions he made using forged medical justification are being investigated by law enforcement, I announced. The room was silent except for the sound of Gary's breathing, which had become audible from across the conference table. Gary, you have until Monday morning to resign from Mitchell Electronics and return any company property in your possession. If you choose to fight this legally, you'll face criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement, I said to my brother. The choice is yours, but either way, Mitchell Electronics will return to the leadership of someone who built it through honest work rather than theft disguised as family loyalty, I continued. Gary looked around the room at faces that had been admiring his leadership moments earlier and were now staring at him with shock and disgust. The employees who'd trusted him, the clients who'd respected him, the business partners who'd been considering deals with him. Alan, you're destroying our family over a misunderstanding, Gary said, his voice barely above a whisper. Gary, you destroyed our family when you decided my heart attack was an opportunity to steal my company, I replied. I raised my champagne glass one final time. To Mitchell Electronics and to the people who've supported it through honest dedication rather than fraudulent manipulation, I said. The toast was met with confused applause from people who weren't sure what they'd just witnessed, but understood that Gary's authority had been permanently revoked. As the party dissolved into uncomfortable conversations and early departures, Gary approached me one last time. Alan, I never meant for it to go this far. I just thought I could run the company better than you realized, Gary said. Gary, you thought you could steal my company while I was fighting for my life. There's no version of that thought process that makes you someone I can trust with anything ever again, I replied. Sarah took my arm as we prepared to leave, her face etched with sadness and recognition. She'd watched me lose a brother while saving the business that represented my life's work. The victory was complete but hollow. Gary would face criminal charges, professional ruin, and permanent exile from the family business that could have been his legitimate inheritance if he'd chosen patience over theft. But Mitchell Electronics would survive under leadership that understood the difference between earning authority and stealing it. The weekend following Gary's public humiliation passed in tense silence. No calls from my brother, no attempts to defend himself or negotiate some kind of face-saving compromise. Just the hollow quiet that comes after a relationship explodes so completely that both parties need time to process the wreckage. Monday morning brought the formal reckoning I'd promised. James Harrison arrived at Mitchell Electronics at 9 o'clock sharp with a court order freezing all company accounts and revoking Gary's access to financial systems. Gary never showed up for work today, Maria told us as James served the legal documents. His office is cleaned out, computer password changed. All the client files he'd been maintaining are missing from the shared drives. I felt my reconstructed heart skip a beat. What do you mean missing? I asked Maria. Everything he'd been working on since your surgery. Contact lists, pricing negotiations, project timelines, either deleted or moved to external storage we can't access, Maria explained. Gary's final act as Mitchell Electronics sales director had been to cripple the company's ability to maintain the client relationships he'd been pretending to protect. James immediately contacted the IT forensics firm he used for corporate investigations. Alan, if Gary deleted files to sabotage the company during his departure, that's additional criminal charges. Computer tampering, destruction of business records, interfering with corporate operations, James said. But the immediate problem was operational, not legal. Without Gary's client files, we had incomplete information about ongoing projects, pending proposals, and negotiated agreements that were crucial to company survival. Maria, What can we reconstruct from backup systems and paper records, I asked. About 60%. The rest will require contacting clients directly to confirm project status and requirements, Maria said. It's going to take weeks to rebuild what Gary destroyed. That afternoon, I called Mr. Thompson to explain the situation and assess the damage to our most important business relationship. Harold, I need you to know that Gary sabotaged our client files before leaving the company. We're working to reconstruct project details, but there may be some confusion about timelines and specifications, I told Mr. Thompson. Alan, Gary called me Saturday morning with a very different version of events, Mr. Thompson said. He claimed you'd suffered a breakdown during Friday's party and were making irrational decisions about company management. The audacity was breathtaking. Even after being exposed publicly, Gary was still trying to manipulate our business relationships by questioning my mental competence. Harold, what exactly did Gary tell you? I asked. He said your heart condition had affected your cognitive abilities more than anyone realized, that your accusations Friday night were symptoms of medical trauma, not accurate assessments of his management, Mr. Thompson explained. He suggested that I consider working with him to establish an independent consulting firm that would provide the same services as Mitchell Electronics, but with more stable leadership, Mr. Thompson continued. Gary wasn't just trying to escape consequences for stealing my company. He was trying to steal my clients as well, using false claims about my mental health to justify his competition with the business he'd been caught looting. Harold, I'm going to send you medical documentation from Dr. Rodriguez confirming that I'm completely competent and have no cognitive impairment from my heart condition, I said to Mr. Thompson. I'd appreciate that, because frankly, Alan, your presentation Friday night was the most coherent and well-organized speech I've heard in months. If that's what mental incompetence looks like, most business leaders could use some, Mr. Thompson said. His support was reassuring, but I realized that Gary's post-exposure manipulation campaign was going to require systematic refutation with every client, supplier, and business partner he'd contacted. Tuesday morning brought news that complicated Gary's legal situation considerably. Detective Williams from the White Collar Crime Unit called to report that Gary had been using company credit lines to pay personal expenses, including gambling debts that exceeded $50,000. Mr. Mitchell, your brother has been systematically embezzling funds since your surgery. We've traced company payments to offshore gambling sites, luxury purchases, and cash advances that were never reported as taxable income, Detective Williams said. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Preliminary investigation suggests approximately $120,000 diverted from company accounts to personal use, Detective Williams said. The number was staggering. Gary hadn't just been trying to steal control of Mitchell Electronics, he'd been using it as his personal bank account to fund a gambling addiction that dwarfed the debt problems I'd suspected. Detective, what happens next? I asked. We're preparing formal charges. Embezzlement, fraud, computer crimes related to the deleted files. Your brother is looking at significant prison time if convicted, Detective Williams explained. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Gary's wife, Jennifer. Alan, I need to talk to you about Gary's situation. Can I come to your house this evening? Jennifer asked. Her voice carried the exhausted desperation of someone who'd been living with secrets that had finally exploded into public knowledge. Jennifer arrived at 7 o'clock looking like she'd aged years since Friday's party. She sat across from me in the living room where Gary and I had planned Mitchell Electronics' expansion into new markets back when I'd trusted him with the future I'd built. Alan, I didn't know about the gambling, Jennifer said immediately. I knew he'd been stressed about work, but I thought it was because he was worried about handling your responsibilities during your recovery. How long has he been gambling? I asked Jennifer. I found evidence going back 3 years. Online sites, casino trips he claimed were business meetings, cash withdrawals he said were for client entertainment, Jennifer explained. 3 years. Gary's theft of my company hadn't been an impulsive response to my medical crisis. It had been the culmination of a gambling addiction that had been growing progressively worse while he'd maintained his facade as responsible sales director and devoted family man. Jennifer, why are you telling me this? I asked. Because Gary's been calling clients and employees since Saturday, trying to convince them that you're mentally unstable and that Friday's confrontation was evidence of your declining competence, Jennifer said. She pulled out her phone and showed me text messages Gary had sent to key Mitchell Electronics employees, encouraging them to contact him about employment opportunities at the consulting firm he was trying to establish. He's not just trying to escape consequences, Alan. He's trying to destroy Mitchell Electronics completely by stealing your employees and convincing your clients that you're no longer capable of running the company, Jennifer explained. The scope of Gary's vindictive response was worse than anything I'd anticipated. He was trying to complete the theft he'd started, using my public exposure of his crimes as evidence that I was the unstable one. "What do you want me to do about this?" I asked Jennifer. "Help him get treatment instead of sending him to prison." "Gary's sick, Alan. The gambling addiction has made him do things that aren't really him," Jennifer pleaded. I looked at this woman who'd been married to my brother for 15 years, who'd raised their children while Gary had been systematically stealing from the family business to fund his hidden addiction. "Jennifer, Gary chose to steal my company while I was fighting for my life. He chose to forge medical documents to justify his theft. He chose to delete client files and contact our employees trying to sabotage Mitchell Electronics after being caught," I said. "Now he's choosing to spread lies about my mental health to complete the theft he started. These aren't symptoms of addiction, Jennifer. These are deliberate criminal acts by someone who's been planning this for years," I continued. Jennifer's face crumpled with the recognition that Gary's actions extended far beyond what addiction alone could explain or excuse. "What happens to our family if Gary goes to prison?" Jennifer asked. "Your family will learn to rebuild without money stolen from mine," I replied. "And Gary will learn that some mistakes have permanent consequences, no matter how much someone claims their addiction made them do it." That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the client files we'd been able to reconstruct, calculating how much damage Gary's sabotage had done to Mitchell Electronics' operational capacity. The financial theft was recoverable through insurance and legal proceedings. The deleted files were annoying but not fatal to company operations. But the trust Gary had violated, the family bond he'd shattered, and the reputation he tried to destroy through lies about my mental health, those damages would take years to fully understand. I'd saved my company from theft but lost a brother to greed and addiction that had been festering longer than I'd realized. The victory felt necessary but incomplete, justice served but love destroyed. Tomorrow would bring criminal charges, civil litigation, and the beginning of Gary's complete separation from the business and family he'd tried to exploit. The consequences would be permanent and devastating, exactly what someone earned for stealing from family during their most vulnerable moment. Some lessons could only be learned through total loss. Some people only understood respect after they'd forfeited any claim to it permanently. 2 years after Gary's sentencing, I received a letter that made the cost of protecting Mitchell Electronics complete. The letter was from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, informing me that Gary had requested to include me on his approved visitor list. He was serving a 4-year sentence for embezzlement, fraud, and computer crimes at a minimum security facility in Missouri. I sat in my office reading the request while looking out at the parking space where Gary's leased Mercedes had once proclaimed his fraudulent success. The space now belonged to David Chen, the young engineer I'd promoted to vice president after rebuilding the management team Gary had tried to destroy. "Are you going to visit him?" Sarah asked when I showed her the letter that evening. We were having dinner in the kitchen where I'd planned Mitchell Electronics' expansion while Gary had been planning its theft. "I don't know what purpose it would serve," I told Sarah. "Gary made his choices. Now he's living with the consequences." Sarah nodded with the understanding that comes from watching someone protect their life's work from family betrayal. "The company's thriving without him. Maybe that's answer enough," she said. Mitchell Electronics had not just survived Gary's sabotage, it had grown stronger under leadership that prioritized client relationships over personal enrichment. The employees Gary had tried to poach had remained loyal once they understood the truth about his gambling addiction and systematic theft. Mr. Thompson had become our strongest advocate, telling other business leaders about my principled response to family crisis and Gary's pathetic attempts to steal clients through lies about my mental competence. "Your handling of that situation showed real character," Mr. Thompson had said during our most recent contract negotiation. "A lot of men would have either enabled the behavior or destroyed their company trying to cover it up." 3 months after receiving Gary's visitor request, Maria knocked on my office door with news that complicated my feelings about family consequences. "Mr. Mitchell, there's someone here to see you." "Jennifer, Gary's wife," Maria said. I hadn't spoken to Jennifer since the night she'd begged me to help Gary get treatment instead of sending him to prison. She looked older but more peaceful, as if living without the stress of Gary's hidden gambling addiction had allowed her to rebuild her life on honest foundations. "Alan, I wanted to thank you for something," Jennifer said as we sat in the conference room where Gary had planned his celebration of stolen success. "Thank me for what?" I asked Jennifer. For refusing to enable Gary's addiction by covering up his crimes or providing money that would have gone straight to more gambling, Jennifer said. Prison forced him to face his problem in a way that family intervention never could have accomplished. Jennifer explained that Gary had been attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings, working with addiction counselors, and slowly beginning to understand how his disease had justified increasingly destructive behavior. "He's not the same person who stole from you, Alan. Prison and treatment have changed him in ways I didn't think were possible," Jennifer said. I wanted to feel glad that Gary was getting help, but I couldn't forget the systematic nature of his betrayal or his vindictive response when caught. "Jennifer, I'm happy that Gary is addressing his addiction, but that doesn't undo the damage he caused or change the fact that he chose theft over honesty when he needed help," I said. "I know, and Gary knows too now. That's why he asked to see you," Jennifer said, "not to ask for forgiveness or money or help getting his sentence reduced, just to acknowledge what he did and take full responsibility for his choices." 6 months later, I drove to the federal prison where Gary was serving his sentence. The facility looked more like a college campus than the concrete fortress I'd expected, but the security procedures and visiting restrictions made clear that this was punishment, not vacation. Gary appeared in the visiting room wearing prison uniforms that made him look smaller and older than I remembered. His face had the drawn appearance of someone who'd lost weight and gained perspective in equal measure. "Alan, thank you for coming," Gary said as we sat across from each other at a plastic table designed to prevent the passing of contraband or comfort. "How are you doing?" I asked Gary. "Learning things I should have figured out years ago," Gary replied, "like the difference between wanting something and deserving it, between needing help and stealing what you can't earn." Gary's voice carried none of the entitlement or manipulation that had characterized our last conversations. Prison and addiction treatment had stripped away the rationalizations he'd used to justify stealing from family. The counselors here made me write letters to everyone I'd hurt during my active addiction, apologizing, accepting responsibility, promising never to repeat the behaviors that caused damage, Gary said. "I wrote you a letter, but I never sent it. Because what I did to you wasn't just about gambling addiction. It was about resentment I'd been carrying since we were kids," Gary continued. I listened as my younger brother finally articulated feelings he'd been hiding behind professional cooperation and family loyalty for decades. "I always felt like the little brother who couldn't measure up to what you'd accomplished. You built a successful company from nothing. I was just good at talking to clients and closing sales," Gary said. "When you had your heart attack, part of me saw it as finally getting the chance to prove I could run things better than you realized, that I deserved more recognition and authority than you'd been willing to give me," Gary continued. The honesty was brutal, but necessary. Gary had been motivated by more than gambling addiction. He'd been driven by sibling rivalry that had festered into entitlement and eventually into criminal behavior. "But stealing your company didn't prove I was capable of running it. It proved I was willing to betray family trust to feed my ego and my addiction," Gary said. "What happens when you get out?" I asked Gary. "I start over, somewhere else, doing work that doesn't involve managing other people's money or making decisions that affect their livelihoods," Gary replied. "Jennifer and I are getting divorced, not because she doesn't love me, but because I destroyed her ability to trust me with our family's financial security," Gary continued. The consequences were complete and permanent. Gary had lost his marriage, his career prospects, his relationship with me, and his children's respect. The theft that was supposed to solve his problems had destroyed everything he'd claimed to be protecting. "Alan, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to help me rebuild my life or give me another chance to prove I've changed," Gary said. "I just wanted you to know that prison taught me something important, that the brother who raised me deserved honesty about my problems, not theft disguised as family loyalty," Gary said. As I drove home from the prison, I reflected on the man Gary had become through consequences I'd been forced to impose. He seemed genuinely different, humbled by experiences that had taught him the real cost of betraying family trust. But change motivated by punishment is different from change motivated by principle. And trust, once shattered by systematic betrayal, can't be rebuilt through apologies delivered from prison cells. Mitchell Electronics continued to thrive under leadership that understood the difference between earning authority and stealing it. The employees Gary had tried to poach had developed into a management team that shared my commitment to honest business practices and client service. I'd saved my company but lost my brother, not through any failure of love, but through his failure to respect the boundaries that make love possible. The parking space where Gary's Mercedes had once sat now belonged to someone who'd earned their position through competence and integrity rather than family connection and fraudulent manipulation. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if Gary had asked for help with his gambling addiction instead of trying to steal my company to fund it. Whether honest conversation about his financial problems might have preserved our relationship while addressing his underlying issues. But those questions belong to a different story, one where Gary had chosen vulnerability over theft, treatment over manipulation, family loyalty over criminal exploitation. The story we'd actually lived was about consequences and the painful education they provide when people refuse to learn less expensive lessons about respect, honesty, and the difference between love and enabling. Gary had learned that stealing from family doesn't solve problems. It creates problems that follow you into prison cells and beyond. That addiction doesn't excuse betrayal, and that some mistakes have consequences that last longer than the behaviors that caused them. I'd learned that protecting what you've built sometimes requires sacrificing relationships with people you love when those people choose to become threats to what you've spent your life creating. The lesson had been expensive for both of us, but worth every dollar spent and every relationship strained to teach it properly. Some people only understand respect after they've permanently forfeited any claim to it. Some education can only be provided by people who refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when enablement would be easier than enforcement. Gary had provided that education at a cost of 4 years in federal prison, the loss of his marriage, and permanent exile from the family business that could have been his legitimate inheritance. It was an expensive lesson, but worth every year he spent learning it. I hope this story touched you, especially those protecting businesses and family legacies from people who see crisis as opportunity for exploitation rather than chances to provide genuine support. If this story moved you, please support our channel with a like, and subscribe for more stories about business betrayal, family loyalty, and the courage to protect what you've built from those who would steal it during your most vulnerable moments. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, or let us know where you're listening from around the world. These stories about family, business, and protecting life's work from manipulation connect people across all cultures and communities. Thank you for joining this journey through family betrayal, corporate theft, and the wisdom that comes from understanding the difference between helping someone and enabling their destructive behavior toward others. Until next time, remember, the most valuable legacy isn't money or property, but the principles guiding how we treat family members who trust us with their life's work, and the strength to protect those principles even when protection requires difficult decisions about people we love.